I just started the recording. I almost forgot. So let's see. We still have a couple minutes. If it's okay, Erin, we'll wait a couple minutes to get more to join, but I'm thrilled to have the folks that we do have. Thanks.
Sure, yeah.
And for those that just joined here, I did put a couple notations down. I see, obviously, you all are muted, and I appreciate that. Okay. We've got 12 participants so far. Hi, everybody. If you're welcome to turn your cameras on if you wish, or you may choose to just keep the black screen. That's great to see the audience and the extra attention that we have from the different packed rooms here. So thanks for joining us. Well, if it's okay, I'll start at 7:03. We'll give a couple more minutes there. And we just had another join. Erin, I assume you can see your screen, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. What I have up in the middle of where your shared screen, you don't see that, do you?
No.
Okay, because I have the list. I have people that are joining in, and I'll just keep admitting them as they go.
Okay, that sounds good.
Started. Make sure I got everybody here so far. Yep, we're up to 17 folks. Thanks again for everybody that's joined in. Welcome to our first virtual Greenville Zoo Conservation Lecture. Tonight, we're very pleased to have Erin Cord of Bat Conservation International talking to us about bats, the diversity of bats, and there being winged wonders. Erin's been with BCI since 2019, and she coordinates the Bat Walk program, which is a volunteer-based program. I'm sure she'll talk a little bit about that during the presentation, as well as what Bat Conservation International is all about. She really enjoys working with volunteers and directing them toward environmental stewardship, wildlife conservation, and learning more about bats. And we had Bat Conservation International as a Quarters for Conservation kiosk project in 2019, to which the Greenville Zoo donated out of the Quarters kiosk. So we're happy to support great conservation initiatives like BCI. And I'll just recap a couple things for the newer folks that have joined in. We in the chat box, I put a couple notes. One, I think everybody's muted, and that's great. And then two, as Erin talks and presents things, if you have a question, go ahead and type it in the chat box, and I'll just keep all those to the end when she's done, and then I'll go ahead and moderate the questions. She will be speaking till for about 45 minutes, and that'll give us about 10-15 minutes for questions. So take it away, Erin, and welcome.
Okay, thank you so much, Nick. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming to my bat talk. It's nice to see some of your faces. Yes, and so I am going to talk to you guys about a couple of different things, but hopefully I will cover everything you ever wanted to know about bats. That's my goal. It's very ambitious, but we'll see. Okay. So I want to talk to you guys a little bit first about my organization, Bat Conservation International, and give you an idea of kind of what we do. Our mission is really, really simple. We want to end bat extinctions worldwide. It's a very ambitious goal, but we feel really, really strongly about it. And that's kind of our main focus. And we do that kind of all over the world in different ways, which I'll talk about more in a second. But just some BCI history, we were founded in 1982. So we're coming up on 40 years next year, which is really exciting. We were founded by Dr. Merlin Tuttle and another gentleman. Dr. Tuttle is a very well-known kind of bat scientist, guru, photographer. He's a really amazing guy. And he decided to start BCI in Austin, which at the time was kind of seen as a kind of a crazy move to do, because Austin in the 80s had just rebuilt the bridge in Congress Avenue, which is kind of what you can see behind me in my virtual background. But they had rebuilt this bridge, and all of a sudden, all these bats moved in under the bridge. And the city was not happy, and people were not happy. They were very afraid of the bats. They didn't want the bats there. And everyone thought it was just a silly idea to start a bat conservation organization in a place where they did not like bats. But through Dr. Tuttle's work, kind of working on changing hearts and minds about bats, and over the years, now Austin, we consider ourselves a bat city. We love our bats. They bring millions and millions of tourism dollars every year. If you ever come here, or if you've been here, maybe you've gone and seen the bats at the bridge. So it's just kind of one story about how BCI started and kind of what we're trying to do. And just there's a lot of misinformation and fear about bats out there in the world, and people don't understand them, and sometimes are really afraid of them or don't like them. And we're just trying to really educate people about bats and tell them why they're so wonderful, and also do lots of bat conservation projects. So we have kind of initiatives and projects all over the world. I was just going to talk about a few. The first is our endangered species interventions. As I mentioned, we want to end bat extinctions worldwide. So these are places where these bats are very, very endangered, down to the last few hundred or thousand individuals. And we want to come in and work with local partners and governments to see what we can do to support them and their initiatives to conserve these bats. So we've got things going on in Jamaica. We were able to actually, in the last couple years, work with the Fijian government to make sure that the last known roosting site for the Fijian free-tailed bat is protected now in perpetuity for forever, which is really, really cool. We're doing some bat conservation in Africa and Rwanda, trying to figure out if the Hills horseshoe bat is still around, and if it is around, where is it? What habitat is it using? There's just so much we don't know. And then in the United States, there's actually the Florida bonneted bat, which is the most endangered bat in the US. They are primarily found in southern Florida. And we have a whole team there called the Miami Bat Lab. That is their very cool logo there in the bottom left. You can go to batlab.org to learn more about them. But it's a collaboration with BCI and Zoo Miami, as well as Florida Power and Light. We're just trying to understand how many bats are left, what roosting sites are they using, and how can we create roosting habitat and habitat for them in general. So it's a really exciting project, and we're learning a lot about Florida bonneted bats, but these are just a couple of examples of stuff BCI is doing all over the world. We also do a lot of landscape protection and restoration. That's a huge part of conserving any wildlife species, is protecting and restoring habitat. We have an agave initiative down in kind of southern United States into Mexico There are nectar feeding bats in those areas that kind of are the sole pollinators of agave. So if you do like margaritas and tequila, thank a bat for that because they will pollinate the agave. But we have people going in trying to understand these pollinating bats because they are endangered, and we're trying to figure out what their migration patterns are and kind of their roosting habitats and things like that. We have volunteers that are actually planting agave plants all along these corridors to provide food for these pollinating bats, which is really exciting. And then we have Bracken Cave, which is this picture down here. This is actually south of me. I'm in Austin. This is between Austin and San Antonio, and it is home to about 20 million Mexican free-tailed bats in the summer. It's a maternity colony, so it's all mama bats with baby bats, and they all come out in this giant bat tornado, and it's the most amazing experience. And if you join BCI as a member, you are, we have member nights at Bracken, but if you ever come to Austin, you know, email BCI, we can try to get you to Bracken. It's a once in a lifetime experience, and we own the property and the cave, and we're working on kind of restoring that habitat and buying up more land because it's an area that's becoming heavily urbanized by kind of Austin and San Antonio encroaching from both sides. Then we also do a lot of subterranean work. That's Jason right here. Him and his team, they do the very cool, like rappelling down abandoned mines and in caves. And they go into these places. It's mostly kind of in the southwest and kind of northwest of the United States. They're checking out these abandoned mines, figuring out if bats are roosting there. And a lot of their work is installing these cave gates, which prevent people from going in and disturbing the roosting habitat, but it allows the bats to go in and out, which is really wonderful. So they do lots of really interesting subterranean work, and they spend a lot of time underground, which is a very cool job if you like that. And then we have a lot of research projects and initiatives. We have a very amazing science team, and they are working on a lot of different things. One of our main priorities is white nose syndrome, which I'm going to talk more about in a minute. But we have a kind of a whole team working on solutions to white nose syndrome and kind of scalable solutions. We also have a team that works with wind energy cooperatives and companies to try to reduce wind turbine fatalities of bats. And I'll talk more about that in a second as well. And then we have our global student scholarship program, which is exciting, where we grant money to students kind of working all over the world, doing different types of bat conservation, and we support them. And a lot of them go on to do really amazing things. So it's a really wonderful, wonderful BCI project and initiative. And then we go into outreach, which is where I hang out. And at BCI, we're really all about providing experiential outreach. And that just means we want you to have a memorable experience with bats, a positive, memorable experience with bats. So obviously Bracken Cave is one of the ways we do that. But you know, if you don't live near Bracken and you don't live near a large bat colony, you may never encounter bats, or you might not encounter them often, or it might kind of not be, you know, it might be a bat on your porch, or you find a bat on the ground. And obviously, if you find a bat during the day on the ground, you want to wear gloves, you want to be smart, which I'll talk about rabies more in a second too. But the other way we've kind of figured this out is we have our Bat Walks program, which is what I run. And we actually use this smartphone compatible bat detector. You can kind of see it right here. It plugs into your smartphone and it allows you to actually hear the bats flying over. So you could have bats in your backyard. You may not see them, but you can actually hear their calls, their echolocation calls. And the detector actually shows you what bat you're probably hearing. So it's a really amazing way for people to interact with bats in a very safe way, and also gives them this really memorable experience, which is really exciting because we find that those experiences are really what lead people to kind of, you know, feeling passionate about bats and bat conservation. And that's what we want to cultivate. So talking about bats, there are over 1,400 species of bats in the world. And this number is constantly going up, but you'll see on this graph, starting in 1982 when BCI began, the number didn't really change much for the first 10 years, but then it really expanded. And that's because we got really good at DNA and figuring out what species were what. So a lot of species kind of, we figured out they were the same species or they were different species, a lot of splitting and lumping and figuring out stuff. And we're still figuring out new species every year. And actually BCI scientists last year discovered a brand new bat called the Nimba myotis in the Nimba Mountains in Africa. They actually caught this bat and they realized it looked different and they weren't quite sure what it was. And they were able to find out it was actually a brand new species of bat, which is really cool. That's kind of the coolest thing you could do as a bat researcher, is find a new bat species. And they got to name it. And it was really exciting. So we're still learning so much about bats, and there's still so much we don't know. So I'm going to throw some numbers at you. You don't have to memorize these. I'll kind of just the general point I will go over. So there's this thing called the IUCN Red List. It's a worldwide kind of list of different species and kind of what their status is. So within bats, over 1,400 bats, there's 5 that are actually extinct. So those are actually not counted in the 1,400. But you get 23 that are critically endangered, 56 are considered endangered, 107 are vulnerable, and then 234 are considered data deficient. So you add all those numbers up, you get about 33% of the bat species in the world need conservation attention. And you know, that number is not great, but actually, if we break it down more, you've got those 234 that are data deficient, but we've got 125 other species that are considered non-threatened, but their population trend is declining. And then we've got 456 species that are also considered non-threatened, but we don't know what's going on with their population. So that gives you all you need to take from this, all these numbers, is that about 80% of the bats in the world need conservation or research attention. So they really, really need our help, and we really need to understand what's going on with these populations. And this is just a survey kind of to let you know kind of what the major threats to bats are in the United States. As you can see, number 1 is pathogens. So that's white nose syndrome. And number 2 is renewable energy. So that's mostly talking about wind turbines and wind energy. And then number 3 is climate change, which I really think this is probably higher now than wind energy. And then there's development, logging, all sorts of kind of other threats that you would kind of normally associate with wildlife. Oh, sorry about that. So yeah, just all in all, in the United States, at least 30% of our bat species are at risk. And I think it's, you know, that number is going up all the time. And they're the most imperiled terrestrial vertebrates. So vertebrates, things that live on land, on the continent. So bats, again, really need our help. So I'm going to do a little bat basics just to go over. I'm sure many of you are bat experts already, which is awesome. But I wanted to kind of go over some bat basics. So you may hear some like very common myths about bats, and I'm sure you've heard some of these, and people will tell you this is absolutely true. I know this is true, but you can tell them why it's not true now. I'm going to go over all of them. So the first one is that bats are blind. Have you guys ever heard the phrase blind as a bat? People say that all the time. My grandma used to say that all the time. But bats are actually not blind. They can see about as well as you or I can. And they can echolocate, which means they use sound to get around at night. So not only are they not blind and they can see as well as us, but they can actually move around in this whole other way, which is really amazing. The next one is that bats are rats with wings or rodents with wings, kind of indicating that they're pests or vermin. Bats are actually taxonomically more closely related to horses than they are to rodents, which is pretty wild, but that is how it shakes out taxonomically. It's very true. And another thing with this, I'd like to point out that, you know, rats, if you've ever had rats in your porch or your garage or your shed, they reproduce really quickly, unfortunately. They have lots of babies really fast, but bats actually don't. They don't reproduce quickly at all. Bats usually give birth to about 1 pup per year. So they're really slow to kind of recover if the population has an issue. And, you know, unlike these rodents, they really are, they are not rats with wings, and they take a lot of time to kind of recover and rebound those populations. This next one is that bats want to get in your hair or nest in your hair. This one's kind of a silly one, but people definitely still say this. You know, I will say bats don't want to be in your hair. They don't want to be anywhere near you. And they can actually echolocate, and they can find something using echolocation that's as thin as 1 human hair. So they're not going to run into your head by accident. And they do not want to be anywhere near your head. So that one is not true. This next one is that all bats are vampire bats, or bats are going to attack you, suck your blood, things like that. It comes from Dracula. But this is a great one I like to talk about because, as I said, there's over 1,400 species of bats, right? Of those 1,400, only 3 are actually feeding on blood, are considered vampire bats. All 3 of those live in Latin America. And only 1 of those feeds on mammal blood. The other 2 feed on birds. So there's really only 1 actual like vampire bat, and we definitely don't have it in the United States, and they're definitely not in South Carolina. So yes, most bats are not vampire bats at all. And all of our bats pretty much in the United States are insect-eating bats. So they like bugs, not blood. The last one is all bats have rabies, or bats have rabies more often than other species of mammals. Bats can get rabies. Any species of mammal can carry rabies. Rabies is a very serious disease. You want to be careful if you think you've been bit by any kind of wild animal. You want to make sure that you're okay. But with bats, there is kind of a sampling bias where a lot of times when people interact with bats, it's like a bat on the ground during the day that's sick. So, people don't normally interact with bats because the healthy bats are flying around at night. You don't know they're there and they're just kind of doing their thing. But when you do kind of come across a bat during the day, there is a chance that it is sick. It could be rabies. You just want to use common sense. Kids, go get your parents. Parents, you want to wear gloves or call like a wildlife rehabilitator and just, be careful. Bats aren't more likely to have rabies than anything else, but you just want to use your common sense. Okay, moving on. I did want to talk a little bit very quickly about coronavirus, COVID, and bats. I know there's a lot of information out there. Some of it's true, some of it's not. And I should say I'm not an expert on this at all. So if you do have kind of more specific COVID questions, I can refer you to somebody on our science team that is an expert in this sort of thing. I will say we don't know yet that bats are the cause of COVID. We know it has zoonotic origins. To me, it came from an animal. We're not sure what animal yet. It's going to take a while for them to figure out. And the main issue we like to talk about with this is the more habitat encroachment we have, the more building and kind of going into wild spaces that we're doing, there's going to be more issues like this where these zoonotic diseases jump from animals to people. So you just want to make sure that, we're being respectful of wild spaces and we're making sure there's enough habitat for things to live, and, we're conserving and restoring and bringing new habitat into these areas just to make sure that kind of we don't have more of these diseases jump. But again, not an expert on this. So if you have more questions, let me know and I can have you talk to someone that is. And I will say none of the bats in the United States are the bats that were potentially associated with COVID. So you can't get COVID from a bat. You can only get it from a person. All right, so back to fun stuff. Bats are mammals, as I said. So this just kind of shows you how you see all these other mammals here. The bones in a bat's wing are actually the same bones that you have kind of in your arm. So you can see their wings are actually their fingers, and they just have this skin kind of attached to their fingers. So when bats are flying, it's like they're waving at you. So if you're a kid and you want to practice that, go for it. It's like kind of they have jazz hands. And it's funny because in Latin, there you go, I see that. In Latin, their order and taxonomic order is Chiroptera, which actually means hand wing. So that makes sense. And you can kind of see this in this picture too. So this is like their thumb right here. And then they have these very long fingers that make up their wings, which is pretty neat. And bats, as I said, bats echolocate, which is really amazing. They use sound to find their prey. So they're flying around at night, right? They're hungry, they're looking for bugs. And so they're actually screaming because they're throwing sound out. And they scream, but we can't hear it because it's a higher frequency than our ears can hear, which thankfully is good, because if you're in an area with lots of bats, it would be absolutely deafening. And bats actually, when they do this, they're able to dislocate their own ear bone while they're screaming, so they don't deafen themselves, which is pretty amazing. But they're throwing out those sound waves, and then the sound waves bounce back off of, say, a moth in this example, and the bat's actually able to figure out where the moth is by doing this echolocation, which is pretty cool. So I have some videos. This first one, you're going to see there's a spider right here in the middle of the spider web. Bat's going to come in, and he's echolocating. You can't hear it, but he's throwing out the sound, throwing out the calls. You'll see him adjust kind of his position and then go for that spider. All right, here comes the bat. You see he's got his mouth open. Woo! Do you guys want to see that again? Maybe one more time. So you see the bat's got his mouth open. He's calling the whole time. And they actually use their body to scoop up the insects, which is really neat. I have another video that kind of shows that too. So this next video, you will see there's a moth right here. And the bat's going to kind of fly up and scoop it out of the air. And actually does a flip and grabs that moth. I'll play that one more time. So they kind of use their whole body to grab their prey in the air. They're kind of like acrobats. So the biggest bat in the world is the giant golden crowned flying fox. They have a wingspan of up to 6 feet. And flying foxes are kind of I don't know, people say often the cutest bats, that's up for debate, but they do have these very sweet looking faces. These guys are found in the Philippines. So we don't have them here. Obviously, these guys are fruit eating bats and they have these very large eyes. A lot of them don't actually use echolocation to find their food. They can actually find it just by finding the food because it's fruit and it's large and they have pretty good eyes. But this is the largest bat in the world. And then the smallest bat in the world is this bumblebee bat. And this guy has a wingspan of about 6 inches. So think about 6 feet to 6 inches, super, super tiny. And these guys are found in Thailand. And they are the smallest bat in the world, also known as the Kit's hognose bat too. They have kind of 2 different scientific names, but that just gives you an idea of the massive amount of diversity there is among our over 1,400 species of bats in the world. So bats are really important for a lot of reasons, besides just being awesome and wonderful. They do us a great service of pest control. I know lots of us do not like pest insects, and bats eat a lot of insects. As I said, pretty much all the bats in North America and all the bats in South Carolina are insect-eating bats. They are insectivorous. So they are doing us a great service because a lot of the insects they eat are things that would attack our crops or our gardens. Those are some of their favorites. And they will eat mosquitoes as well. And I know that nobody likes mosquitoes. So bats do us a great service. They actually save our farmers. One study came out and said it was about $20 billion annually by doing this pest control for them for free. That means the farmers don't have to use as much pesticide, which is wonderful. That means less chemicals in our food. So these bats are really doing this kind of amazing thing. And one bat in Bracken Cave, so one Mexican free-tailed bat in Bracken Cave, that large cave I talked about, they will eat their body weight in insects every single night. So think about that. Every bat is eating their body weight in insects every single night. That is a ton of insects that they are eating that we're not going to have to deal with, which is really cool. So they're really, really important for pest control. They are also important pollinators too. Not so much the bats that we've got here in North America, but there are some pollinating bats kind of in the Southwest and many, many more pollinating bats kind of as you go further south. But as I said, they are the sole pollinators of agave, which is really wonderful. But they also pollinate a lot of kind of the wild types of some of our favorite fruits that we eat. So bananas, guavas, mango, about 500 different species of plants that are ecologically important as well as economically important are pollinated by bats. And so I have another video just to show you how pollinating bats work. You're going to see, this is a lab, so this is not real. Pretend this is a flower, and this is the nectar at the bottom of the flower. You're going to see our pollinating bat come in. And they're really efficient pollinators because they get really, really far in the flower. So if you imagine he's just getting covered with pollen right now, if this was a real flower. See his tongue comes out, and then they slurp up that nectar just like a straw. So that's our pollinating bats. The last, one of the last reasons bats are important is for seed dispersal, and these are mostly kind of our fruit-eating bats. Fruit-eating bats eat a ton of fruit, and in areas, especially in rainforest areas that have been clear-cut, like this picture here, a lot of wildlife will not cross this because it doesn't feel safe to them because it's super open and exposed. But at night, a lot of our fruit bats will fly across this, and when they poop, which is called guano, fancy word for bat poop is guano. The seeds that's in their guano will actually kind of become these pioneer plants that are kind of the first things to revegetate these clear-cut areas. So about 95% of new growth in clear-cut rainforests are seeds that have been dropped by bats. So they're really, really important, kind of the architects or pioneers of new rainforest growth. All right, so now I'm going to talk about threats to bats, and this could kind of be a whole nother presentation, but I'm going to try to keep it short and sweet because there's a lot there, but I want to keep it light too. So I mentioned white nose syndrome a couple of times. Some of you guys have probably heard of it. It gets the name because the infected bats actually have kind of this white nose pattern here on their face, and that gives you no sense that they're dealing with white nose, but that's where it comes from. So white nose syndrome is caused by a fungus. That fungus was first found in the United States in 2006 in New York. We don't exactly know how it got here. Probably a person brought it over from Europe or somewhere else by accident, but we really don't know. But from that point, they started to notice it, and it's very contagious. Once bats have white nose syndrome and they have the fungus, it's incredibly contagious. And unfortunately, it has spread across the country. So this gives you an idea of all the different this gives you a sense of the different colors are the different years, and you can kind of see how it's spread across the US. And, we had our first white-nosed bat death in Texas last year. So that was pretty devastating. But as you can see, there's definitely lots of cases in South Carolina. And you can go to whitenosesyndrome.org if you'd like to know more about the origin of white nose and kind of what you can do to help. I'll talk a little bit more about it. So basically, white nose is caused by a fungus called Pseudogymnasticus destructans, or PD. PD causes kind of these skin infections or lesions on bats. So PD loves kind of areas with low temperature and high humidity. And unfortunately, that's a lot of caves. So our hibernating bats, and not all bats hibernate, but some that do, they tend to go into these caves that kind of have these conditions where PD really, really thrives. The fungus loves it. And unfortunately, when the bats get PD and get infected by it, it causes lesions on their skin. You kind of see that up close here. And, when they're hibernating, they kind of have these fat stores to get through the winter, to make it through hibernation, because they're not feeding. Obviously, when they're hibernating, there's not really food available, but it causes them to kind of be uncomfortable, and they can't thermoregulate properly, and they kind of get cold and they wake up. And every time they wake up from torpor or hibernation, they use their fat stores. And if they do that enough, they end up starving. So that's actually how white nose kills these bats. And it's pretty terrible. And since 2006, at least 3 bat species have lost about 90% of their population. So the little brown bat, the Indiana bat, and the tricolored bat have all seen over 90% population decrease because of white nose syndrome. And that's kind of, you'll just see caves covered with dead bats, and it's really, really sad. And BCI is working on a lot of different solutions to this, and I'm happy to talk about more of those if you guys have more questions, but I didn't want to put too much in here because I wanted to make sure I covered everything. Okay, the next kind of main threat to bats is wind energy. And I will say, renewable energy is wonderful, and we're all very supportive of wind energy. But unfortunately, for reasons we don't quite understand, it seems like bats are actually attracted to these wind turbines. We're not quite sure why, but we're trying to figure that out. And unfortunately, when they're kind of come in, bats are very curious by nature. And when they come in to kind of check out these turbines, they end up kind of getting hit by the turbines, and they end up, dying, because these turbines are really big and really powerful. So it's caused about 100,000 bat fatalities per year. And there's about 24 different species of bats that are impacted this, but mainly it's kind of our migratory solitary tree roosting bats, like the hoary bat, the eastern red bat, and the silver-haired bat are the ones that seem to really be impacted by these wind turbines. And unfortunately, certain species that I mentioned that have had this devastating impact from white nose syndrome also have these issues with the wind turbines as well. So BCI is actually working in a cooperative with a bunch of wind energy companies, and we're trying to figure out different solutions to mitigate this risk and support renewable energy and kind of prevent more bat fatalities. And then climate change also obviously is impacting everything. It's impacting bats as well. And we're still really trying to understand how it's impacting bats. We can say for sure there's going to be less consistent food and water availability because things are changing. Things are not happening at the right time with kind of different temperatures. So it's going to kind of change a lot of different things about bats. And we're still sort of just figuring this out and seeing this. We've had issues we've noticed with bats overheating in certain areas, especially in bat houses. So in places where kind of habitat is gone and bat houses are used as a replacement for roosting habitat, they're not the same as a natural habitat, unfortunately. And sometimes they can get overheated, and the bats actually can, get overheated in these bat houses, and they don't have anywhere else to go. So kind of that being said, there's still a lot we don't understand. We know it's impacting bats. We know it's going to continue to impact bats, and we're just trying to kind of understand and get more data. And then, of course, habitat loss and urbanization, kind of the two go hand in hand, especially in the US. Things are getting developed very quickly, and we're losing a lot of natural habitat. And so these are things that are impacting bats along with all of the other things that I already talked about. So there's a lot of threats to bats and to kind of wildlife in general, but I am going to talk about some ways you can help. So hang in there. But first, I wanted to go back to something fun. I'm going to talk about some bats you guys have in your area. So in South Carolina, you have about 14 total species of bats, which is really great. You guys, it's a pretty batty state, which is very cool. The first one is the big brown bat. This is probably the most common bat in your area. As you can see, these guys are very brown. It's a good name. They love bat houses. So if you do have a bat house, and I'll talk more about bat houses in a second because I don't want you to think that they're all bad. But if you do have a bat house, big brown bats may very well be kind of the thing occupying them. And if you do see bats kind of flying around your yard or kind of your park at dusk, it's probably a big brown bat, but it could be other things too. But these guys are very, very common. Then there's the eastern red bat. This one, the male has this beautiful orangey red kind of fur, and they're just so pretty. These guys are kind of some of our longer migrating bats. So these are definitely impacted by wind energy, but they are solitary bats. So you think of bats normally kind of roosting all together. These guys generally roost alone, except the mama will roost with her babies, but they will hang out in trees. You know, they don't hibernate in caves. They hang out in trees and they migrate, and they kind of curl up and they sort of look like a dead leaf. So they're really good at blending in with a tree, and you'll never know they're there. You could have them in your yard right now, and you'd never know it. They're pretty amazing for a lot of reasons, but as I said before, bats usually give birth to about 1 pup per year. The red bat mamas can sometimes give birth to 4 or maybe even sometimes 5 pups in 1 year, which is just totally bananas. So they're really amazing that way, and they actually have a lot of babies for a bat. It's pretty extraordinary. The next one is the evening bat. They're very kind of a nondescript brown bat as well, but they have very sweet faces. These guys also like bat houses too, so you could get them, but they really like to roost in kind of dead trees and snags and things like that. So, you know, if you have a dead tree or you have kind of a stump or something in your yard and you can leave it up and it's not a safety hazard, that is a great bat roosting habitat, actually. It's really wonderful. The next one is the hoary bat, one of my favorite bats, and they are called hoary bats because you'll see kind of the silver on their fur here. It's said to resemble hoarfrost, which is what this is. So kind of that really spiky, cool looking icicle frost. That is where they get their name. These guys are the biggest bats, they're not the biggest, but they're one of the biggest bats in the United States. They're really, really good at flying. They have kind of long angular wings and they migrate really far distances. They eat a ton of bugs. Sometimes hoary bats, if they find an area with lots of mosquitoes, they will just gobble them up, which is pretty great. We love that. These are actually one of the main bats impacted by wind energy because they are kind of our long-term migrators, which is unfortunate. But as I said, BCI is kind of working on that. And you see they kind of occur all over the country. So they are kind of found everywhere, but they're not common, I would say, anywhere. And sometimes, you know, we'll only hear them here in Texas when they're kind of migrating through. So it's kind of special when you spot a hoary bat or with your bat detector. The last one I want to talk about is one of my favorites. I feel like I said that about all of them. They're all my favorites. This is the Mexican or Brazilian free-tailed bat. So kind of depending where you are in the country, you'll hear it either Mexican freetail or Brazilian freetail. In Texas, we say Mexican freetail. In Florida, they mainly say Brazilian freetail. You guys could say either one. Honestly, they're both right. It's all the same bat. But these guys come from the genus Tadarida, which is the wrinkle-lipped bat genus. You can see they have kind of these very cute wrinkly lips right here. These are kind of the ones that nest in these giant colonies. So the bats in Austin that are flying out sort of behind me as I'm talking, the bats at Bracken Cave are Mexican free-tailed bats. They tend to just have these giant maternity colonies. They all aggregate together and kind of safety in numbers, taking care of their babies. So if you have a large, you know, if you do have areas where you can kind of see a lot of bats emerging at night, it potentially could be free-tails, could be big brown bats too. But these guys are in your area, and they're actually one of the bats that we've noticed is kind of experiencing a range expansion, potentially because climate change is making things kind of warmer in certain areas. We've kind of found them farther and farther north every year. So I feel like this range map is from 2019, and I know they found them in Baltimore last year. So we're kind of still figuring out what their range is, but they seem to be expanding their range. So, okay, so you know your bats now. There's more. I only covered a few, but you're wondering probably, how can I help bats? What can I do? And it's not as straightforward a question as it kind of sounds initially, because bats are cryptic. You know, we don't necessarily see them. And if you don't live near a large roost, you may not even realize you have them in your yard or in your park or in your neighborhood. So I kind of have a couple of different things. The first thing I wanted to talk about is something I'm super excited about. It's something we're working on at BCI. It's actually kind of a new outreach program we're developing, but it's gardening for bats. Very, very exciting. So what that means is, since we mostly have insect eating bats in the United States, You want to plant the native plants that attract the native insects that the bats are eating. So think about it as creating this bat buffet for all these bugs that the bats are going to eat. So with this in mind, we kind of created this pilot garden in Austin, which is right here. It's definitely work in progress, but we had a lot of help from the Native Plant Society, kind of developing our plant list and our recommendations. And we hope to kind of put more bat gardens all over the place. And we're coming up with plant lists for different regions too. So we don't have a plant list yet for South Carolina, but it's definitely on the list. But we have kind of some general recommendations, and I will say kind of take these and think about them. And also a lot of the native plants recommended for pollinator gardens also support species that bats eat as well. And I will say the bats are not eating kind of the charismatic diurnal pollinators like monarchs and bees. They're eating the nighttime pollinators like moths and kind of things like beetles. So they're not eating the monarchs. Somebody was very worried about that when I told them about this idea, but no, day pollinators, totally safe and good. But what you want to do is plant things that are kind of smelly, like fruits or very fragrant flowers. That attracts a lot of night insects. They kind of find those things. Things that bloom at night are wonderful because as they're opening their flowers, you'll actually see, the pollinators are coming right when the bats are coming out to roost. So the timing is great. Lighter colored flowers, white colored flowers tend to attract moths and kind of beetles and other things that bats like to eat. Host plants for moths is kind of we often think of host plants for butterflies, but you can also do host plants for moths and find information about that. That is wonderful too. And then actually your garden plants, honestly, if you can garden organically, all the things that are like eating your kale and your cauliflower and your tomatoes, all those create delicious moths. Those caterpillars become delicious moths for bats. So it's just kind of some general rules of thumb to jump off of, I will say. And then a lot of people ask me about bat houses, and I will happily talk about these if you have more questions. Bat houses are great. I would say put in native habitat, put in native plants first if you kind of have a choice. Make that habitat, make those plants that attract the insects. That's probably has more conservation value for the bats. But putting a bat house is a totally wonderful way to welcome them to your yard as well. There's a lot of bad bat houses out there, so make sure you're buying the right kind. And there's a ton of information on our website at batcon.org about bat houses. I'm also happy to answer questions. My email's at the end of this. You can email me. You just want to make sure your bat house doesn't have screens or mesh in the inside. That's kind of an old school way of doing it. We realize that that's not safe for the bats. They can get stuck as the bat house kind of degrades. So you don't want that. You want the larger the bat house, the better. You want 3 to 4 chambers at least, because you give the bats more options. It attracts potentially more bats, and they can kind of move around the bat house if the temperature is not right. If it's really hot in the front, they can move to the back. People will sell you bat attractants like sprays and powders and oils. None of that works. There's no way to really attract a bat to your bat house except for kind of crossing your fingers, installing it in the right way, and kind of hoping that they show up. Unfortunately, it takes kind of some patience and sometimes some nuance, but don't pay money for those things. They do not work. And then you want to paint it the right shade. For your area, you want to go with like a medium to darker shade of paint because you want to make sure that it kind of gets that sun and absorbs that heat and kind of stays warm enough. And then there's lots of rules about installing them. They need at least 6 to 8 hours of sun per day. And you don't want to get that hot afternoon sun. So we usually say kind of put them facing south or east or southeast is usually kind of best. At least 20 to 30 feet from the nearest tree. Don't put them on a tree because then they're really vulnerable to predators. And actually putting them on a building is best. You can put them on a post as well, but actually a building is best because the temperature kind of stays more regular. And then 12 to 20 feet from the ground. And then if you have them near water, that's fantastic. That's first thing you do when they come out at night is drink. So if you have water, and I'll talk more about what water you might need. And then just patience, obviously. And then I think I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna speed up here. Other things to think about in your yard, trees are fantastic. Obviously, trees provide habitat for tree roosting bats, but they're also host plants to a lot of different insects, especially certain types of moths. And they also provide, trees actually keep their flowers open. They don't close their flowers at night or anything like that. So they actually are a great kind of source of attracting insects as well. As I said, leave up the dead trees if you can. That's wonderful. And then thinking about vertical layers where you just kind of have different things growing at each layer of your kind of canopy, that attracts a lot of different insects. And that's a great way to kind of think about gardening in a smaller space. So other yard tips, keep it organic if you can. Don't use pesticides and herbicides. Keep your kitty inside, at least at night. You know, if you can keep them inside during the day, that's great too. But for the bats, keep your kitty inside at night. And then if you can turn your lights off and keep your yard as dark as possible, that's really helpful for the bats too, because too much light can actually interfere with their ability to echolocate. And then for water, unfortunately, a bird bath is not enough. Bats need about 7 to 10 feet to drink because they come down and swoop and drink on the wing when they're flying. So if you have a pond or kind of a long trough, that would be great for bats. You just want to make sure you have kind of an exit ramp along. If you have a pool, sometimes they'll drink out of your pool. But you just want to make sure you have a wildlife escape ramp if you do have water to make sure they don't get stuck. Because they'll actually, if they fall in the water, they'll kind of swim around until they find kind of a way out. And that's true for most wildlife. And the last thing is be a bat advocate. So I know I told you a million things today and there's lots of information, but the best thing you can do is just talk to people about bats, explain why they're awesome, explain why they're not scary. And you can make a big difference, you know, just telling people what you know and kind of what you think they should know about bats. So with that, there's our website. Feel free to check it out. That's my email. Please email me with any questions. You know, if you don't get them answered tonight, I'm happy to take emails. And thank you guys so much for listening.
All right. Well, thanks, Erin. We've got a couple questions here. One, and you touched on it, but if you could recap, where do bats mostly live?
Oh, that's a great question. And it really honestly depends on the species. So bats will have roosting habitat where that could be, you know, a cave, it could be a tree, it could be a bat house, it could be under a bridge. And then they kind of have their feeding habitat, which is usually kind of an open area where there's lots of insects. You know, so some bats kind of prefer more forested areas. Some bats prefer kind of more open spaces. So I guess the long answer is many places. And that's kind of, it really depends on the species, but they're all over the United States. They're all over the world. I guess, I don't know if that, does that answer that?
Sure, that covers a lot of territory. And a question on the water source that you were talking about is, would it work as a river as far as a water source? Would it provide?
Absolutely, yes. And I bet if you have a river nearby, probably not so much now, but once it kind of gets warmer again in the summer, you go to the river at dusk and you'll probably see bats kind of swooping down to drink. And I'm sure lots of insects kind of are emerging from that river. So bats love to eat mayflies and dragonflies and all sorts of things like that.
Okay. And looks like we have a question from Emma.
Hi, Emma.
Would it work like if like we don't like have very many insects? Like we have like insects, but like what if would happen if we used like insect spray because we don't like insects in our house because they come in too much.
I know it's hard. And, you know, obviously if it's in your house, the bats aren't going to be in your house eating the bugs. And I understand like people want to spray for mosquitoes and things like that. I will say the mosquito sprays, they do kill other bugs too. So that's tough. But, you know, I think if you can have like a space in your yard that's kind of, you know, if it's just native plants and or your garden and you're not using, you know, bug spray on those, that's awesome because they'll provide lots of insects just in that small area.
Okay.
Okay. Really good question. Thank you.
Yeah.
Would it work? Like, would it work if you like sprayed it on wood? Like, would it still kill like the bats?
The bats?
Yeah, because we have a lot of bats in our neighborhood. I've seen it like a lot.
Cool. That's awesome. So it sounds like, you know, whatever you're doing is okay. If you have a lot of bats there already, that's great.
We saw one actually perch in our tree on Halloween.
Well, that sounds like good luck to me. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's perfect. We have a question from Danielle in the chat box that they have a bat box at their house and bats squeak. Why do they squeak?
They make a lot of noise. They kind of chat amongst themselves. That's usually what you hear in the bat box. And, you know, they're just talking. They're communicating in kind of their own batty way. So that's usually what you're hearing. And sometimes you can hear some of those squeaky communication noises are a lower frequency than the echolocation calls, so that's why you can hear them. But yeah, they're just chatty sometimes,
Okay.
just like people.
I don't see any more questions here, but if in the reaction, oh, here's a question. Okay. How do you treat bats for white nose syndrome?
Oh, that's a great question. So it seems like kind of once they are infected, there's not much we can do for them, unfortunately. They are working on a lot of different ways to kind of prevent them from getting infected. That seems to be, or to help them go kind of survive the infection. One thing BCI is working on is potentially inoculating bats or kind of, you know, trying to, but that's not really scalable. You know, you can't inoculate 20 million bats in a cave. So one of our other projects is actually called the Fat Bat Project, which I love the name, but they found that bats with kind of larger fat reserves tend to survive white nose. You know, if they're hibernating and they have more fat reserves, they can potentially make it through a winter, even if they do wake up a lot from white nose. So we're actually working on creating kind of these feeding stations with light traps in areas that are kind of known roosts for bats, to just kind of fatten them up before they go into hibernation. So that's the kind of plan, is to just fatten the bats up and give them a chance to kind of get through white nose. But there's still so much we're trying to learn and figure out with white nose. It's really a huge problem.
Okay, great. We have one more question. Where can one buy the listening device for the phone for the bat?
Oh, that's a great question. It's through Wildlife Acoustics. I can put it in the chat. They are about $180, so it's kind of expensive. But if you think about it in terms of like buying a nice pair of binoculars to go birding, it's cheaper than that. But they are called the Echometer Touch 2. I'll write it in the chat. And it's just wildlifeacoustics.com. So yeah, they're really cool to have. And if you do get one, feel free to, you know, email me if you have questions on how to use them. And because you do want to put in the species that you have in your area, so it's not going to mis-ID something. But they are really, really cool. And it just blows people's minds the first time they kind of hear that echolocation call, and then it tells them what bat they're probably hearing. It's really exciting.
Okay. I don't have any more questions. If those want to talk in real time, if you want to do the reaction and put your hand up, I'll scroll and see if anybody else has questions. If not, it's been great, the questions we've had.
Definitely. So
far, I think you've been very thorough, Erin. Not a lot of questions there.
That's okay.
Oh,
I feel like I covered a lot, so sometimes it's hard to take in.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. And for those that want to catch this again, we're recording this, so it will be available on our website, and we'll have a follow-up email that we'll send to let you know about that. While I have everybody here, we'll be starting back the lectures most likely in January. I'm getting 4 other organizations to report on what they do and their initiatives. And they include the Wildcats Conservation Alliance. We've donated to their Amur leopard efforts, the Giraffe Conservation Foundation, and Red Panda Network. So looking to do all virtual, and looking forward to having you join us. But we'll send information on how to connect back up on our website to listen to the talk again, for those parts that you might want to hear again, and the cool videos too. All right, well, thanks everybody. I appreciate your joining us, and have a good night.
Thanks so much, Nick, for having me. Thanks everybody. This is super fun.
Good night.